So apparently Ground News is currently getting lambasted by a lot of people on left-wing platforms, and I kind of want to know why. So there's a guy named Literate Machine who made a video called "Is Ground News a Psyop?" And like I said, I am really interested in what the fuck is going on here, so we're gonna watch it together.
Hi. Now, in my last episode about Ground News, I talked about how there's been a many-decade-long effort by a lot of extremely rich people to create an alternative media ecosystem of reactionary thought under the term conservative media. And part of that project was to portray all media that wasn't conservative media as liberal, meaning left, and behave as if it existed explicitly to further a political agenda the same way conservative media does, in an entirely successful effort to use the mainstream media's...
Okay, it's not that I don't respect what you're doing. It is that you are speaking slow. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I am going to speed you up, and I am going to increase your volume. Jessica, thank you for giving me your points for an owl.
Own ideals of neutrality, independence, and objectivity against it to platform reactionary ideas and move the Overton window rightward. And it's probably my fault because I buried it a bit, but it's important to understand that, for the most part, this conservative media exists not to accurately report the news, but to expressly further a reactionary agenda, which is why we have ample evidence of people who've been in conservative media discussing how they were never fact-checked, and to the contrary, encouraged to make things up to further the cause, deliberately stir up controversies out of nothing, and be extremely subjective while assailing the lack of objectivity of everyone else. And I kind of feel like if you don't understand that conservative media is composed chiefly of lies, fear-mongering, racism, and grifters, you're either not paying attention or are also part of the cult. And this is why a service that presents conservative media...
So, he's actually completely right about this, because a lot of conservative media stems from Fox News. And Fox News was created by Murdoch in order to have a juxtaposition to CNN. It was literally a attempt to have a competitor with CNN, not to have a more accurate news website, not to have something that was better, just to have something that was different. That's all that was wanted, was something that was different than CNN. And that means that even if CNN reported 100% correctly on something, it was up to Fox News to provide an opposite spin, even if it was ridiculously inaccurate.
On equal terms with the actual news media, and even denotes it as in the political center, serves only to legitimize and validate their lies. And by doing so, it also pushes socialism and socialist ideas like, I don't know, significantly raising taxes on rich people further to the periphery, helping to delegitimize them. And some people accuse me of being unbiased, but part of the point of the video is that there's no such thing as being unbiased or objective.
Correct. I don't know how many times I have said these exact words on my channel, but everybody is biased. Everybody is. The people who tell you that they are unbiased, objective sources are objectively fucking liars, and they are the kinds of people who should be trusted less. I find somebody who points out what their bias is, and they are internally and externally aware of that bias, to be infinitely more trustworthy than somebody who tries to say that they are objective or they are, cut from a different cloth or whatever the fuck.
And the pose of being unbiased serves only to reinforce the status quo, strip events of their moral weight, pass off official accounts from authority figures as neutral facts, and create false equivalences between truth and lies. But I finished the video by saying that I might think Ground News is a right-wing psyop if I were conspiratorially minded, but the people running it and its sources might completely believe they're honestly providing a useful service. However, some folks pointed me to some interesting evidence that Ground News might actually be a right-wing psyop. And just to be clear, by psyop here I don't mean a literal military psychological operation, but just the idea that Ground News was intentionally created to spread and legitimize right-wing ideas under the guise.
So that is something to note as well. Like, in the modern era, a psyop, like QAnon was a psyop. QAnon, we know, thanks to the Epstein files, was quite literally built to be a staging ground for right-wing conspiracy theories so that you could have easier access to shit like Epstein Island being a thing that was less scrutinized, because talking about something as fanciful about that would make you look like one of the crazies, thanks to whatever engineered version of an outrageous event that they had put on one of those platforms. It's also what's going on with the DSA. The whole situation with the DSA where like every single like Democrat seems to be anti-DSA now is part of a psyop from a centrist media organization that has spent $15 million on a campaign to delegitimize the DSA because they're tired of the DSA beating establishment Democrats.
Of being impartial and exposing bias. And I'll say here at the top that this evidence isn't conclusive, but it is pretty suggestive. And I think it's worth taking a moment to look into it and see what it tells us, not only about these sorts of services, but about deeper issues around money and journalism. And I'm still definitely not getting that GroundNews sponsorship, so please consider supporting this project on Patreon at patreon.com/EricRosenfield.
Man, I feel like my channel should have gotten a GroundNews sponsorship ages ago, but I don't think it's ever happening.
Where for only $1 a month, you can get Earth Creates centrist discourse and neoliberalism that I had to cut from the last video. Anyway, according to
Chaotic says, I can't find my Junko Chaotix, are you trying to do the Junko cosplay like as we speak?
its website, GroundNews was founded by siblings Harleen Kaur, ex-NASA engineer, and Suk Singh, ex-Bain Capital. Yes, that Bain Capital, the private equity and vulture capital firm whose CEO and sole shareholder was once former governor.
Said maybe are we trying to bait me again? Is this the same thing Bon Bon was doing earlier? Because I'll tell you right now, like in the middle of that, I got like 30 cosplay images from Bon Bon purely to rage bait me.
Governor and Republican presidential hopeful Mitt Romney. But even aside from that, this is weird, right? Neither of these people have backgrounds in journalism, media, or media analysis. They're an engineer and a finance guy. And this background shows, for instance, in something I neglected to mention in the last episode, the use of AI to summarize news stories. Journalists might not appreciate the idea of a computer program summarizing their work, and as someone who cares about news, I would be, shall we say, concerned about the accuracy and trustworthiness of these summaries.
Yeah, using AI to analyze content and summarize things, on the one hand, I understand why at a certain scale it would be necessary. At the same time, once we have an AI summary of something, I immediately feel like I have to scrutinize the summary infinitely more than I might have originally, because it's just going to fucking hallucinate shit sometimes. Also, an anonymous gifter, thank you for gifting a tier 1 sub to Chaotic Entity Comics. Apparently for a Junko cosplay. I give up, man. My community are all degenerate, every single one of them. All of you are corrupt, none of you are sinless.
Replacing a news source that may be biased or untrustworthy with software that has no idea what bias or trustworthiness is doesn't sound to me like an improvement. I could also point out how much the right wing seems to like AI in particular as a piece of circumstantial evidence, but unpacking that is a bit orthogonal to the main point I'm trying to make, so we'll put it aside for the moment. I said in the last video that the site is funded not only by subscribers, but by venture capital firms and unnamed independent mission-aligned investors, according to the website. Who are these investors? Well, typically if you make a significant investment in a startup, giving you a significant ownership stake in it, you get a seat on the board of directors that controls the company. GroundNews is technically a subsidiary of a company called Snapwise Inc., which you know because it says copyright 2026 Snapwise Inc. at the bottom of the GroundNews website. Though curiously, that's not mentioned on their About page. Also curiously, the name of the parent company used to be on the Wikipedia page for GroundNews, but that seems to have been removed at some point for some reason. So who's on the board of Snapwise Inc.? Well, we see the founders, Kaur and Singh, that's expected. We have Payman Paladij, who's a known angel investor, which is to say a rich person who invests in early-stage startups. We have Tom Curley, and this is the only person on this board who actually has experience in journalism. He was the president of the Associated Press, helped found the USA Today in 1976, and actually worked as a journalist. Digator
says it's back on Wikipedia, by the way. Thank you for pointing that out. Thank you for pointing that out. That actually helps a lot, because sometimes you can get a really, really weird perspective when somebody says something that is technically true at the time and has been since corrected, but you have no way of knowing something has been since corrected.
This is the kind of person you'd actually want to see involved in a company like this. And then you have Manuel Matkey. Now, Matkey doesn't personally seem to be an angel investor, but he is the president and COO of Opportunity Education, a company that provides educational materials to private and charter schools, and he's the president of a company called Factual IQ, which uses AI to help leaders in mid-market companies make strategic decisions rapidly. And he's on the advisory board of another company called Straight Arrow News, a news site that promises to provide unbiased news without agenda. Straight Arrow News even shows news stories that are primarily
unbiased news without agenda. That's not accurate. I'm sorry, but once the news is being written by a person, it's biased. Once the news is coming out from an AI, it's also biased because a person was the one who okayed the training data that got the AI where it was.
Being reported by left-wing or right-wing news sources in order to show people things that they might be missing in their biased blind spots. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? In fact, they say this media miss feature is done via their partnership with, you guessed it, GroundNews. And who actually owns Straight Arrow News, Factual IQ, and Opportunity Education? One, Joe Ricketts, founder of TD Ameritrade and billionaire Republican mega donor involved in a number of conservative organizations and projects, and someone who's donated millions of dollars to the campaigns of Donald Trump. Well, that's curious. As I said, if you invest in a company, you typically get a seat on the board, but if you're a big company or a very wealthy person with lots of companies you're involved in, you delegate that responsibility to one of your employees who answers to you.
Okay, so I do need to say, and I feel like everybody probably already knows this, right? This is kind of just understood immediately. But remember that investors care about their favorite color, which is green. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes their political wants and preferences don't actually make it into the company because they value making money more than they value their own personal indignations. However, sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes the opposite is 100% true, where somebody is on the board of directors and their wants and needs politically are pushed over and above anything that is, required financially. So unless we know what's going on in those meetings, we don't know exactly how much influence one way or another is had here. I do need to throw that out there.
So it sure seems like Ricketts is one of those mission-aligned investors of the site, especially since his own site uses their product. Ricketts also incidentally founded the news site DNA Info in 2009, but shut it down along with other news sites he'd acquired, Gothamist, LAist, and DCist, in 2017 when their staff voted to unionize. What a swell guy. Special thanks, by the way, to Jude Peen for...
Okay, so that one pisses me off because, if there is one thing a board of directors will be able to do, no matter what, is try to fight people under the board. That's something they will do irrespective. And a lot of people who would be on a board of directors simply do not want you to unionize. This is not a good thing. They are not your friends. They are not great. They are other people like you or me. They are just greedier, have more power, and should not be fucking trusted. You know who can be trusted more? The proletariat. People who actually are on the same economic level as you and have the same incentives as you. The person at the top there, the person who's a investor, they don't have the same incentives as you. They care about the company succeeding, but the company succeeding could easily be at the cost of you surviving. They don't have the same incentives that you do.
For bringing my attention to Snapwise and its board. But let's keep going. As mentioned in the last video, GroundNews bases its ratings on the work of 3 other independent companies, All Sides, Advantes Media, and Media Bias Fact Check. The CEO of All Sides is John Gable, an entrepreneur who has worked for the Republican National Committee and describes himself as lean right. Just a little lean. According to the website, he started the company with the CTO, Scott McDonald, a developer and entrepreneur who describes himself as politically center, though we've seen what that bias rating apparently means. They brought on Joan Blades as a member of the board, she seems to have no other role, a woman who co-founded MoveOn.org in 1998 and rates herself as politically left. Now, founding MoveOn, an organization that endorsed Bernie Sanders for president in 2016, is a genuine left liberal bona fide. However, Blades doesn't seem to have been involved with MoveOn for some time. A successful and wealthy entrepreneur, Blades has written a Girl Boss business book, founded a women's advocacy group called Moms Rising, and has focused on political polarization with a project to get people to have conversations across the political aisle, called Living Room Conversations. Because she has no actual role in the day-to-day operations of the company, she seems to be there as a kind of token liberal to lend legitimacy. According to the site, these 3 have a controlling stake in the company and are the only members of the board. Needless to say, none of them have any background in journalism. Meanwhile, the Director of Communications and Bias Services, who wrote many articles and guides to media bias, Julie Mastrine, rates herself as lean right, and according to the team political alignment page, can be associated with the notional American political faction, the Patriot Party, the, quote, party of Donald Trump's 2016 primary campaign.
Jesus fucking Christ. That's interesting. Okay, I'm interested to see what's going to happen when it gets to media bias fact check, because I've used media bias fact check for years. Jessica says, I just saw a post on Threads saying minors can groom people and can be abusers. I'm so done with the internet. I mean, a 17-year-old is in fact a minor, and they can in fact groom a 9-year-old. They also can in fact be an abuser. I have personally had to run intervention for somebody who was being abused by a partner who they were both teenagers when this happened. I was as well, mind you, but those are all objectively true statements. There isn't a magical cutoff at which we suddenly go from being technically angels to being infinitely responsible. I said, yeah, but I'm talking about someone who's 12 or 10. Right. But you just said minor, and minor is person under 18.
Campaign who are the coalition of small-town, white, working-class Americans who feel left behind by globalism and condescended to by cosmopolitanism.
By globalists, so by Jews. It's just, I hear globalism and my brain just goes, ah, yes, da Jews. Okay.
Forget that the idea that Trump's base was primarily working class is more of a marketing point than anything based in reality, with his voters actually tending to have higher than average education and income, but I digress. And her bias guides openly advocate both sides reporting, saying a balanced piece of journalism will include perspectives from both sides in equal measure. In reality, this kind of both sides...
No, that's not true. So, journalism should not be balanced. Journalism should be accurate. That is what journalism should be. The idea that journalism should be balanced is based on the misnomer that both sides have something equal to contribute to a conversation. But if side one is a scientist and side two is Alex Jones, one of these sides actually has something worthwhile to contribute, and the other is Alex Jones.
Sidesism is itself actually a form of media bias. Giving both sides when one side is telling the truth and the other is lying just legitimizes the lie. In fact, if you wanted to intentionally legitimize a lie while trying to come off as unbiased and impartial, both sides reporting is not a bad way to do it. And her bias guides are embedded with all sorts of right-wing assumptions. For example, in her article Beyond Left versus Right, 14 Types of Ideological Bias, Mastrine has some odd choices for types of ideological bias. For example, along with things like authoritarian versus libertarian and traditionalist versus progressive, she has elitist versus populist, which is a framing that obviously flatters the populace. People who are against populism don't call themselves elitists. Further, she notes there, because major institutions of power are concentrated in American coastal cities, we often hear about the conflicting values and ideologies between coastal elites and rural/middle America, another way of framing elitism versus populism. And this is certainly the way the right likes to frame elitism, but it has nothing to do with the actual divide between rich and poor, with plenty of poverty in coastal cities and with supposed right-wing populists actually representing the interests of the rich and powerful.
It should also be noted that, so populism is just a political ideology. It is not the difference, it is not the them versus the us from populism versus the elite. The elite can use populism just as much as anybody else, right? It's literally just the idea of trying to pit ordinary people against the perceived corrupt elite. But if you call the perceived corrupt elite the Jews, that's still populism. And that is likely being used by people who are actually in the elite. When you say that Mexicans are coming to steal your jobs, that is populism, but it is almost always being pushed by somebody who's in the elite. That's not a dichotomy.
As one can see by the fact that one of Trump's key laws massively slashed taxes on the rich. But worse is the entry nationalist/localist versus globalist. Much as no one actually calls themselves an elitist, no one calls themselves a globalist. In fact, the term globalist is only used by the right and is historically associated with a shadowy international cabal of financiers, and even more precisely an anti-Semitic notion of the sinister power of international Jewry.
Ha ha! He got it in one! I mean, I'd kind of expect that if he's studying this stuff for his job the same way I have to do for mine, then it would make sense that he would just know that and could give you that. But thankfully, this means that I don't have to come up with the, by the way, globalism means the Jews thing. The video did it for me.
As for nationalists, when that word isn't used to describe independence movements like Irish nationalists, it's usually used to describe, well, folks like Trump, who declared, "You know what I am? I'm a nationalist," as part of an ethno-nationalist program against those of a different ethnicity than the majority by framing them as not really part of the nation, e.g. not real Americans. Far more troubling, however, is her article Slanted, How Partisan Media Use Data to Draw Wildly Different Conclusions. In talking about voter fraud in the US, Mastrine has quotes from both NPR and the Heritage Foundation, implying both are equally valid sources, even though one's a news organization and the other's a right-wing think tank.
Yeah, no, they are not. The Heritage Foundation made Project 2025. They are just an agenda. Yes, CNN has an agenda, the same way that anybody who reports on things and is a human being with blood in their bones, or blood in their veins and marrow in their bones, is in fact a person who has an agenda. But let's be 100% honest with ourselves. CNN cares more about giving you information than Heritage Foundation does, even if CNN is also a biased organization that needs to be scrutinized too. Mephron says facts care about your feelings as much as Ben Shapiro cares about his wife's sexual pleasure.
And concludes, in sum, the right says the available numbers show fraud exists and have changed elections, and that fraud might be much more frequent than reported because it's so hard to catch. The left looks at the numbers and says it's not a big problem. Now, besides the weaseliness of the phrase might be much more frequent than reported, where you're basically imagining evidence that isn't there, every source I found that isn't explicitly right-wing concludes that the heritage numbers are wildly inflated, grossly exaggerated, and devoid of context.
Yeah, it's the Black Book of Communism thing all over again, where yes, the USSR was responsible for a lot of deaths and should be scrutinized for it, but the 100 million dead number was the number that was assumed first by the author and then was post hoc calculated in order to get to that number afterwards. Something that the peers said, Suris, your DMs, I will get to it in just a second. But something that the peers who even edited the book pointed out was wildly inaccurate and problematic. Argentile says, what's the Black Book of Communism? The Black Book of Communism is a propaganda piece against communism that was used to claim that communism was responsible for the deaths of 100 million people. But it used a fuck ton of fuzzy math to get to the 100 million mark, because 100 million was the mark the author wanted to get to before they even started doing the research. They just started counting backwards from there instead of counting forwards like you're supposed to do when you're doing data.
For example, Heritage claims thousands of non-citizens were registered to vote in Virginia, when the case more likely involves human error, like people who didn't check the citizenship box in their DMV form or checking it erroneously and then not replying to a notice to correct the error within 14 days, and so being removed from the rolls. The Heritage vote...
Also, I did just see the DM, and yeah, no, like, you are right. You are built like Junko with a bit more budge. Like, that's, you are correct.
Voter fraud database itself only contains 1,100 individuals total across 749 cases going back decades, with the oldest from 1948, out of millions of votes cast, and even the contents of that database include...
Argentile says, I hear that number all the time when people want to argue communism bad. Good to know where the sources for more context. Yeah, it comes from Black Book of Communism, and when you are hearing stuff from the Black Book of Communism, you need to see the actual methods that were used to get to the numbers in the book. It is not that the Black Book of Communism is wrong in that attempts at having an authoritarian bent version of communism like what existed in the USSR. It's not wrong that that regime led to many deaths. It is just inaccurate in how they calculated the exact number and very, very biased in how they did so. Also, as is always the case, we always have to point out that communism is a classless, stateless, moneyless society, and the USSR was not those things.
A lot of incredibly questionable things. In other words, voter fraud isn't a case of two sides drawing different conclusions from the same data. It's a case of one side brazenly lying about the data and the other side not doing that. Far worse, though, is the section on police brutality, which discusses a statistic that Black Americans are 2.5 times as likely as white Americans to be shot and killed by police officers, and whether or not that's evidence of racism in the police. Much space is given here to right-wing writer Heather McDonald, explaining that Black people are just more likely to commit crimes, and therefore more likely to encounter the police, including the whopper, in St. Louis, she says, Blacks commit up to 100% of all homicides, even though they are less than 50% of the population. Mastrine then concludes by saying that both sides apparently agree that there needs to be more research around violence in the Black community.
Right, but when we do research about violence in the Black community, we find that it's a combination of over-policing that leads to more violence being reported and a higher propensity for Black people to be sentenced by juries of their peers than white people, because we have a bias against them, just thinking that they are less trustworthy for some reason. We have a psychological bias there that we still need to work out of our collective systems. So you have the combination of over-policing on top of areas that have been redlined and therefore have less economic opportunity, leading to higher crimes. And then the added benefit, I guess you would say, of, yes, on top of this, the likelihood of the courts not going in your favor is higher when you are Black. Like, all of that wraps up together to give us those numbers. So we get numbers that are technically accurate, but you need to do a little bit of research into why those numbers are what they are.
So this is really, really racist.
Yeah.
McDonald's is explicitly saying that police violence against Blacks is the fault of Black people because they're inherently violent. And Mastrine then essentially agrees and says what needs to be studied more is not police violence, but Black violence. Now, if someone were actually interrogating the bias of McDonald's piece, they could point out that the term up to in up to 100% is a weasel phrase used to make one high statistic stand in for many. They could point out that the statistic is cherry-picked from a single police report from 2017, covering only 15 homicides that doesn't distinguish between suspects and convicts, meaning guilt hasn't been proven. And the statistic is false anyway, because the same report covers 28 homicides, meaning for 13 cases, or 46%, there's no suspect at all. In fact, as noted by APM reports, of the 1,900 homicides in St. Louis between 2014 and 2023, 1,000, or more than half of them, remain unsolved. So you can't credibly claim that more than half of homicides are committed by blacks.
Because less than half of the homicides, not significantly less, but just a little less than half the homicides, just don't have any reporting at all. So you just don't have the information.
They could also talk about the prevalence of racial profiling and about how blacks are far more likely to be exonerated for crimes than whites because they're much more likely to be wrongfully convicted. They could even bring up the relationship between poverty, inequality, and crime, the fact that on average whites in St.
I love how he's just bringing up everything I brought up. I like this guy. He's done his research. He's done his research. Every reason I gave, he is giving in different words. He did good. He did it good. This is a good video. As somebody who's had to look into this shit, he's done good.
Louis are 4 times wealthier than blacks, and the systems that work to keep them that way, including racial profiling and police brutality. And of course, they could point to plenty of actual research on systemic racism and police killings, showing that police brutality on African Americans is a very real problem if George Floyd and the New York police once sodomizing a man with a broomstick weren't enough to convince you. In fact, if McDonald blaming the victims of these crimes reminds you at all of the reporting on lynching I talked about in the last episode that firmly blamed lynching on the victims and their behavior, well, that's what it reminds me of too. But this kind of analysis would require someone to actually care about how data is misused to further a particular agenda and to reinforce existing stereotypes and social hierarchies. Instead, all this does is demonstrate all too well how both sides' reporting, rather than exposing truths, actually aids in obscuring them. In fact, Mestrin's whole slanted document is basically an instruction set for how to use a neutral tone and both sides' framing to validate and legitimize falsehoods and lies.
Yeah, Kennedy Comics says at this point it's not just a whistle, it's not just a dog whistle, it's just a whistle. So it is still a dog whistle because if I go to, say, the card shop and I talk to just a normie there and I do the spite meme, they will just nod their heads with it and just go on with it, because they don't have any context for why it's wrong, which makes it still a dog whistle.
Moving on to Advantes Media, which was founded by Vanessa Otero and began life as the Media Bias Chart, a chart that places news organizations on a graph with 4 axes, left and right, and more or less reliable, i.e. truthful. Otero does not have a background in information literacy or journalism. She was an intellectual property lawyer, and before that apparently worked as a regional advisor for Nouveau Riche, a non-accredited vocational school specializing in real estate investing that was later exposed as a multi-level marketing scam. And the board of directors of Advantes Media is entirely made up of venture capitalists and business types, though the advisory board does have a token journalism professor, Walter Dean, who apparently helped develop their rating methodology. And there's also an actual economist there who writes about political bias, Max Stearns. But the rest are wealthy investors, finance and marketing types, and there are a lot of them. 4 on the board of directors beside Otero, and 16 others on the advisory board.
Again, though, this is just how venture capital works. Like, I'm not trying to defend any, like, fucking venture capitalist who's just injecting money into thing, but oftentimes, irrespective of the political bent of the thing, they are just injecting money into it hoping for a return. The color green supersedes any other loyalties that they might have. It doesn't mean that they aren't going to try to infect any project they're a part of, but it is still an important distinction. I don't know. To be fair, though, at the beginning of the video, he did note that none of this is hardline proof. This is circumstantial evidence, and this is what circumstantial evidence usually looks like. So that is fair.
And just looking at the bias chart, perhaps the most obvious thing that jumps out at you is that there seems to be a confluence between how politically center outlets are and how reliable they're supposed to be. And because of how center seems to be defined, this creates some odd results. For example, 60 Minutes, which is marked as left-leaning, seems to have a similar reliability score as Fox News. This chart, in other words, could be used in the dictionary definition of false equivalence. Also, it's hard to understand, for example, classifying The Young Turks, a show that bills itself as progressive, as being farther left than the openly socialist Jacobin magazine, unless you think more inflammatory rhetoric with lots of exclamation points are what makes something more left. I tried to dig in more into how exactly these scores were reached, but while they'll give you scores for...
Especially with Anna Kasparian recently, like, just, if you know, you know.
For some specific articles, there isn't a lot of detail. For example, Jacobin has an article called "The Government's Own Number Crunchers Agree We Need Medicare for All," which Advantes Media gives a left bias score, which is to be expected, but also a relatively low reliability score, 20 out of 65. However, the numbers that are discussed in the article, which mainly come from the government's own Congressional Budget Office, seem pretty accurate to my mind, and I'd be curious to know exactly what the Advantes team found unreliable about them. Advantes Media has a white paper that describes their ratings methodology. And while this document doesn't have the obvious red flags of the all sides material, it becomes pretty clear how their ratings come to be the way they are. First off, it rates the political spectrum specifically in terms of the positions of US elected officials, which is already going to be a problem if the ostensibly left party is more like a European conservative party, while the other one decided to take a dive straight into the deep end of the fascism pool. But it's also worth noting that even Democratic elected representatives are generally well to the right of the Democratic electorate. As mentioned, Ad Fontes Media gave a high left bias score to a pro-Medicare for All article, which might indeed be a far left position for our elected representatives, but it's a position that's actually supported by a majority of Americans, and therefore should really be a center position for Americans as a whole, with the bias of our politicians against it evidence of the fundamentally undemocratic nature of our electoral system. Or consider how many Democratic politicians seem to support crypto despite it being unpopular with their voters, thanks to their willingness to service the billionaires who pay for their campaigns or might pay for the campaigns of their opponents. And this rightward tilt of the bias scale is exacerbated by the methodology used to rate articles and news sources. Each article is rated by a team of 3 analysts who self-identify as left-leaning, center, and right-leaning. Now take an article like the one above from Jacobin, which lays out the data about how Medicare for All actually gives people better care for less money. In terms of the bias rating, of course, everyone will rate this article left given the parameters that have been set. But when it comes to evaluating the reliability, the right-leaning person is going to, say, question all the numbers and perhaps produce contrary numbers provided by right-wing media. Someone like Julie Mastrine from All Sides or Heather McDonald in this milieu could probably produce the same kind of bogus data McDonald did about black violence in order to make the claims in Jacobin seem less reliable. And since the political scale used here is defined by our elected officials, it's possible none of the 3 might be in favor of Medicare for All, and so predisposed to believe information sowing doubts on the Jacobin claims. According to the methodology document, if the scores are within an 8-point range out of 64, they're averaged together, and if they're not within an 8-point range, there's a discussion to try and bring them within that range, or else the article is sent to another set of analysts.
Interesting. Also, having 3 people rate every article feels like that would be an overwhelming task. I guess it makes sense that a lot of these places rely on fucking AI.
Which means as long as things are within that range, the justification for the rating doesn't even get discussed, and any actual research involved might be cursory if done at all. The whole system seems built, in other words, to favor a right-leaning perspective with few guardrails to ensure that the whole thing isn't based chiefly on vibes. Now compare this to the work of an actual fact-checker at a news organization who's expected to have certain credentials, experience, and professionalism. Which isn't to say that these fact-checkers are infallible or that the system is perfect, it's obviously not. But it certainly doesn't operate with the assumption that different political biases are necessarily equally reliable, especially when one side is known for bad faith arguments and the belief that winning is more important than being truthful. The side that consistently claims things like global warming is a hoax, Barack Obama was born in Kenya, vaccines are bad, and the efficacy of trickle-down economics is not a side you can rely on to evaluate the truthfulness of statements. And if you don't understand that, you don't really understand anything. But at least they can speed up the process by using AI, which is also something Ad Fontes Media has been doing. So that's
like I
something
said,
interesting, right? And finally,
I fucking said, let's introduce a methodology that requires us to independently look at every single article, and in so doing, we are going to end up relying on fucking robots. That's why the venture capitalists are in it, by the way. It's the AI shit. Always the fucking AI shit.
Come to Media Bias Fact Check, which is completely owned and operated by one Dave Van Sant, who according to the site retains final editorial authority. The site does not have paid employees, only volunteers. Unsurprisingly then, MBFC doesn't try to vet every single piece of news, but instead samples a minimum of 10 headlines and 5 news stories from each news source to determine ratings. Which doesn't seem like enough, but okay. Van Sant proudly claims to be apolitical, as if that were a good thing, saying the only political contribution he ever made was giving $10 to the campaign of Bernie Sanders out of an objection to corporate influence in politics. So that's nice. And Van Sant apparently works in healthcare, though I haven't been able to determine what he actually does in healthcare. Media Bias Fact Check has its own methodology page where it describes bias along 4 categories: economic, social, straight news, and editorial bias. Now, for the economic scale, well, their definitions of communism, socialism, and democratic socialism are completely wrong. Though
Hold on. Let's see. Okay. Communism. Collective state ownership of major industries and the elimination of near elimination of private control of the economy. Classless, stateless, moneyless. Very different. Socialism supports extensive public ownership, economic planning, and strong government control over major industries. Again, incorrect. Democratic internal control of all major industries is not the same thing as government control, because that democratic control is happening from within those enterprises, much like a guild, and infinitely less like a top-down government system. Democratic socialism, democratic government combined with substantive public ownership, expansive social programs, and strong regulation of private enterprises. That sounds more accurate to what that is, because that's functionally the Bernie Sanders platform more than anything. Page says, or a co-op. I mean, socialism, like functionally, socialism is when all industry is a co-op. Like all industry is made up of co-ops at that point, of various sizes, or those co-ops become guilds. Like that's socialism.
Though it'd take too long to explain why here, see my episode Star Trek into Socialism for more about that. But at least they're on the scale and mentioned as things that exist. And while it can make sense to rate the straight news and editorial, which is to say opinion biases, differently, it's strange that they're separate from the economic and social categories that then become part of the final ratings with them, when it seems like the economic and social categories are what you'd rate the news and editorial sections with. But ultimately, this methodology really seems designed around the particular idiosyncrasies of a single person, which is a problem particularly when that person doesn't have a background in journalism or media analysis. Still, media bias fact check is the only one that actually rates the Wall Street Journal as right-wing, so that's something.
W's for media bias fact check.
They're also the only ones who are staunchly against using AI to do their work for them, which I suppose points to the lack of wealthy venture capitalists breathing down their neck. Now, an obvious objection to my pointing out these companies being largely funded by venture capitalists and run by entrepreneurs would be to say, what do you expect? That's who funds and runs companies. Well, yes, but that's part of the problem, isn't it? As Upton Sinclair was pointing out over 100 years ago, the rich own the media, and the rich are far more likely to be right-wing than left, with ever more media organizations being bought by ever richer people and ever more right-wing people. Which is to say, the leadership and ownership of these bias rating companies, with the possible exception of media bias fact check, since I don't know the financial situation of Van Zandt, seems to be stock full of exactly the sort of people who might be, say, getting very concerned, as The Economist was, about the rise of Gen Z socialists who might try to tax away their money. I mean, we know what the politics of Silicon Valley are like these days, don't we? And the thing is, most people don't have much tolerance for right-wing media, especially when it glorifies as nakedly corrupt, dishonest, and violent an administration as the current one. You're probably not picking up the National Review or turning on Fox News if you're not already pretty deep in the pool yourself. So why wouldn't a billionaire Republican megadonor, someone from an investment bank with Republican ties, and an engineer see an aggregator showing news from all sides as an effective tool for exposing non-right-wingers to right-wing viewpoints? An aggregator that will further serve to push to the extreme and delegitimize actual socialist ideas while legitimizing right-wing ones and placing them closer to the supposedly reliable center.
This is one of the reasons why GroundNews sponsors everyone, right or left. It's part of that whole false dichotomy thing.
Because this is the thing. Even if GroundNews and these other services aren't deliberately right-wing psyops, they're clearly doing the same functions as one. And the more reactionary wing of the capitalist class has gotten ever larger, bolder, more powerful, and much, much richer, while the less reactionary wing is only too willing to make space for them. As an illustration, the supposedly center-left New York Times just happily gave editorial space to David Ellison to claim that he didn't want to make unbiased news at all. He wants to make news that's straight down the middle, which must be why he gave CBS to Barry Weiss of the right-wing Free Press, who's proceeded to fire longtime journalists and replace them with right-wing hacks, often with little journalism experience, and force Trump talking points on journalists about things like ICE murders.
Oh boy! It's like what One American News Network did, where they're like, yep, you should just make all the liberals write all the right-wing talking points.
But as we've seen many times before, part of the way the notional neutrality of A.G. Sulzberger's New York Times manifests is its willingness to let right-wingers openly lie in its pages with little pushback. And the more the economy goes K-shaped, the more wealth inequality increases, the more people are forced into poverty wages and homeless encampments, while others have more wealth than anyone in history, the more capitalism spins apart, the more the capitalists are going to close ranks to shut the rest of us out. So what do you think? Do you think GroundNews is actually a right-wing psyop? Let me know in the comments. Also, I promised a note on the term liberalism because it came up in the comments a lot. As I've discussed before, the main problem with the term is that it has different definitions depending on who's using it and the context in which it's used. Take the Liberal Party of Australia, which is what we in America would call libertarian, in favor of free markets with little government oversight, and this is what's also sometimes called classical liberalism. Neoliberalism is actually called that because it's the new version of this kind of liberalism. In America, though, liberal is sometimes used to mean left, where someone who's more left is more liberal, which actually mirrors what happened to the word conservative, which is also something that didn't used to work that way. Being more right-wing didn't mean you were more conservative, it just meant you were reactionary. I actually use the term liberal this way a few times in the GroundNews piece as shorthand, just because it's the way the conservatives are also using it, but I know it can be confusing. Because we leftists, particularly in America, tend to use the term liberal to describe the position of wanting to preserve capitalism, but have a welfare state and regulatory controls to guard against its worst effects.
That's how I generally define liberalism. You're okay with capitalism, but you want a feather fall.
Which is distinct from actual leftism, which wants to abolish capitalism. This, of course, is why calling the New York Times leftists or talking about left-wing billionaires or describing, say, Barack Obama as a leftist is the height of absurdity to us. And liberalism, by this definition, actually basically describes the status quo, and defending that and believing change should be slow and careful is the traditional definition of conservatism, which is why we say liberals are conservatives, and also why in this country we have one conservative party and one fascist party.
Who do you trust to be your president, the Republican or Donald Trump?
But this variance in definitions and understandings is just another reason why trying to divide up the news media in terms of a simple left-right spectrum makes no sense. And a service which makes these determinations for you is one that's not revealing something, but imposing a very specific political worldview and portraying that as reality. And that's why we have to ask what this worldview actually is, what does it imply, and who might be trying to impose it on us. Anyway, I talk more about conservatism and fascism in the video How Conservatives Become Fascists, and I talk a lot more about the origin of the term liberal and how it got to mean these different things in an essay available only on my Patreon at patreon.com/.
Okay, fair enough. So my perspective would be that it's not a right-wing psyop. I don't think GroundNews is a right-wing psyop. I do agree with the idea that it is serving many of the same functions that a right-wing psyop might attempt to push for. Like, I do get that. I 100% get that. But I don't think I would say that it is, in fact, a right-wing psyop at all. I think that it is, man, I don't want to say dangerous, because that's not really the word that comes to mind immediately. Not dangerous, but certainly something that needs to be kept in check. people who use Ground News and think, oh my God, because I'm using this, I'm getting all of the news sources. That is a problem. That is a problem. Because like he pointed out, when you do that, you are throwing a bunch of legitimacy on hack news, like Fox News. Fox News's perspective is not welcome in a pool of experts. Fox News's perspective is only welcome when you are tired of experts telling you that the world operates the way that the world fucking operates. And you would rather them, not. You would rather them not tell you that you're wrong about the world operating the way that you don't want it to. That complicit in creating the current view of sports team politics? Yeah, that's definitely something. That's definitely something there. No, because I feel like when you have this idea that, well, everybody's got some perspective on the truth and the truth lies somewhere in the middle, I think that false equivalence between all sides of media is dangerous as fuck. So, yay! Not Psyop, but certainly doing some of the same jobs. I can agree with that. Hey, you made it to the end. I want to give an extra thanks to the patrons who allow me to do this full time. I want to thank Aaron Rail, Astral, Britzkrieg, Jemshin, Poundini, Red Joker, Victoria, Jonas, Craig, Tarika, Fireshard, Smiling GM, John, Dren Hadamada, Creeper, Sagitta, I'm not saying that last part, Sylvie Snow, Valis of Seraph, Ottoman Angel, Rooster Rachel, and Fire Panda, who are all my $20 and up patrons.